In this lesson, we'll learn how we can use a feature called revolving to build our surfaces out of curves. Okay, so revolve is actually really going to be good for creating any kind of a rounded surface, but it's good for creating some rounded surfaces that may otherwise be really difficult to create. So let's take a look at what we're actually going to be constructing here. This will hopefully make a little bit more sense as we start to build it out. So what I'd like to do is create the nose piece here, the part that's going to encompass sort of the turbine blades whenever this is built up. So a method of doing this is going to work really well again because this is going to be a rounded surface. So a revolve should work really well. Now, a couple of key things to remember when it comes to using the revolve. Number one, this is going to work because my engine is perfectly aligned to this main grid line, this main axis here. So that's going to be something that is really important. Also, it's also aligned in this other view as well. Again, this will be a little bit easier to see. If I were to pull back, we can see that this horizontal line is running right directly through the center part of my engine. So with that in mind, let's come in and start to actually build out the shape that we want. So I'm going to turn off my grid just to make this a little bit easier to see. And I'll kind of get in here toward this front part. Now what we want to do is start with a curve, and that curve will basically be the profile of the shape that we want to build, and then we'll actually revolve that curve to build the shape. Again, if that doesn't make complete sense, hopefully this will be a lot more clear here in just a moment. So let's start with a curve. So let's go to Create Curve, and we'll draw bicubic CVs. Okay, now when it comes to actually drawing out a curve, the direction in which you draw your curve is very important. Otherwise, you can start to wind up with some inside out or some reversed surfaces, which is something that we have seen already. So to ensure that your curves are drawn out properly, a good rule of thumb is to always draw your curves in a counterclockwise direction. So I'm going to start up here at the top, kind of right up here at the lip of my engine, and I'll start with a couple of these CVs that are really close together, so that way we can have a nice tight curvature here. Now I can come around and use maybe just a couple of CVs right in here to hold this shape. And once we get down here a little bit further, again, maybe just a few CVs that are really nice and close together. We'll take this up and around, and I'll try to make myself a little bit more of a lip, kind of on the inside. So a couple more CVs right there, and then finally back in. Now once we're finished, we can tap the space bar to finish drawing, and if we want to, we can maybe get in here a little bit tighter and start to take things like a few of these little points back here and maybe start to pull those back. Okay, and again back in here before we get too much further, and come back and maybe try to get some of these points a little bit closer together, so that way we have a nice tight curve and hopefully not too much gap between the actual shape that we're building and the next piece of this engine, which is back here. Okay, so let's take a look at what it is that we've actually done. So we have this curve, and now what we want to do is use that to build a new surface that goes all the way around. So with this curve selected, let's go to Create. We're going to create a surface mesh, and we're going to create it by revolving around an axis. So let's click on this. You can see the default method is to revolve it around the y-axis, which does give us some sort of interesting effects, but it's really not the direction that we want to take this. Instead, we want this to go around the z-axis. And now you can see that essentially what's happened is it's taken the shape and now built a new surface around that. Again, just sort of using this as the main profile. So this should work pretty well. If we want to, we could always come in and start to increase the number of divisions. So maybe we wanted to add a few more in here, we could certainly do that. As far as the V divisions, I think that this will work just fine at 1, so we won't go too far into that. So if I were to close out that property page, you can see now here is our shape that we've built up. Now what is really nice about this is the fact that this shape is still tied to this original curve. So I could still come in and grab some points on this curve, and as I start to modify those, you can see that we can still have full control over this shape. So maybe if I wanted to grab this CV up here and start to adjust that curvature, maybe pulling that under. I could maybe also take this CV down here at the very front and maybe grab those, try to pull those a little bit further apart, maybe start to introduce a little less of that sharp point in there. Maybe try to give that something that is a little bit more rounded out. So overall we have really lots and lots of control over the final shape of this. And maybe if we find that this is a little bit too long overall, we could still come in here and again have full and total control over that. Now once we have this set up and we are ready to move on, we can start to again make some more drastic changes to this and even start to add some additional features. So if I were to take a look at this and maybe start by building in sort of a central piece for the actual turbines to connect to, sort of a central pivot here, we could build this out in exactly the same way that we built this little front nose covering. So once again, I'll jump to something like my right view. Now this time I'm going to press the G key on my keyboard to turn my grid back on, because I want to make sure that this thing aligns to that central axis, because again this is the axis that it's going to be revolving around. So let's go to Create Curve, draw bicubic CVs once again. And again, we're going to make sure that we draw this in a counterclockwise direction. So let's start somewhere out here. We're going to draw outward, down, and we're going to stop right at this grid line. When we're done, again, just tap your space bar. Okay, and with that in place, let's once again go to Create Surface Mesh and revolve around axis. Again, we need to make sure that we set it to the proper axis. And there we go. Now again, if we start off with a shape that maybe isn't quite what we want, we should still have full control to be able to come in here and modify this by just simply adjusting the curve. So if I needed this to be maybe a little bit wider or a little bit larger, just tag some of those points on my curve, start to pull those up and out. There we are. Maybe also start to grab some of these CVs up here, some of these points, and start to maybe just pull those a little bit further forward. And just continue to adjust these until I have the shape that I want. Okay, so very nice. So you can see how very quickly we can come in here and with just a few very simple curves start to create some fairly complex shapes that otherwise would be really difficult to try and create otherwise. So in our next lesson we're going to look at how we can start to add the actual fan blades for this turbine engine.